The south bank of the Callaway River holds the last light longer than any other stretch I know. The way the ridge to the west angles back just enough, the way the hemlock canopy thins at that particular bend, you get an extra 20 minutes of usable gold before the dark comes up from the water. Lena knew that. She would always slow her wading at that bend, settle herself on the flat rock at the edge of the shallows, and rest her rod across her knees, and just watch the light change on the surface. Every October for 11 years, she did exactly that. I used to stand back and let her have it. Some moments are not for guiding. I need to back up, though, because the night I am trying to tell you about did not make any sense to me until I had carried it alone for a while, and even now, I want to be careful about how I say it. I am not a man who reaches for explanations I cannot stand behind. That matters to me. So let me go back to where this started, which is 3 years before that evening, and a warm October afternoon that ended in a way I have never fully gotten past. My name is Dean Coleman. I have guided fly fishing on the Callaway River and its tributaries in the hill country of western North Carolina for going on 27 years. I started young, in my late 20s, working for an outfitter out of Clyde before I got my own certification and my own stretch of licensed water. I know this river the way a man knows a piece of machinery he has rebuilt with his own hands, the way he knows which bolt tends to back out, which fitting likes to weep in cold weather. I can read a hatch from 50 yards. I can put a client's fly in a 1-foot window of holding water from a kneeling cast with the wind in my face. That is not a boast. It is just what 27 years gives you. Lena Marsh found me through a regional sporting magazine in the fall of her 57th year. She had learned to cast the summer before from a nephew who had more patience than technique, and she wanted, as she put it in her first phone message, to do it right before she got too old to enjoy it. She had a school teacher's directness on the phone. She told me what she already knew, which was not much, and what she wanted to learn, which was everything, and she asked what I charged and whether I required waders, or if she could use her own. I told her my rate and told her her own waders were fine if they fit and sealed. She showed up that first October with a pair of Sims that still had the hang tag on the boot foot. We fished together every October after that. One trip, always the third week, always 3 days on the water. She was not a natural caster, not what you would call gifted, but she had what most self-taught people lack, which is real patience with the learning. She did not get frustrated when she tailed a loop or lined a fish. She would just pull the fly back quietly, recheck her grip, and try again. By her 3rd year, she had a serviceable reach cast. By her 6th year, she was reading water on her own, pointing out feeding lanes before I mentioned them. I started arriving at the launch expecting a conversation rather than a lesson, and that felt right. She talked about her husband some. He had died of a stroke in her 3rd year of retirement, quickly and without prolonged suffering, which she said was a mercy, though she said it in the way people say things they have worked hard to believe. She talked about her son, Walt, who lived in Asheville and called on Sundays. She talked about the garden she kept, the cats she fed, the paperback mysteries she traded at the library in town. She was not a woman who dwelled. She was one of those people who occupy the present with the ease of long practice. And being around that kind of ease is something I have always been drawn to, probably because it does not come naturally to me. The October she died, she was 68 years old. I was 51. The afternoon was warm for the 3rd week of the month, the kind of slow southern warmth that hangs on past its welcome and makes the fish sluggish. We had worked the morning run well, moved a couple of browns out of the undercut below the split, and come up to the south bend after lunch for the afternoon session. Lena had been casting well, relaxed, her line laying out smooth on the back cast. She had waded to the flat rock around 4 o'clock, the way she always did, and sat down to rest her rod across her knees. I was 20 feet upstream, watching a rise form near the far bank. When I heard the sound she made, I thought at first she had slipped. It was not a cry. It was more like a breath stopped wrong. I turned and she was already listing to one side, her hand going out toward the rock surface, and I was moving before I understood what I was seeing. I had my wilderness first aid certification current. I knew what to do and I did it correctly. All of it, the compressions and the call and the assessment and the waiting for the helicopter. I did everything right and it did not matter. She was 68 years old and her heart stopped on the south bank of the Callaway River on a warm October afternoon, and there was nothing in 27 years of guiding that had prepared me for that sentence. Walt called me 2 weeks later. He left a message, and I did not call back. He called again in November, and I listened to the message 3 times without picking up. He said in both messages that he did not blame me, that his mother had known about her heart and had chosen not to worry herself or anyone else with it, that she had done exactly what she would have wanted to do on the day she wanted to stop. He said it plainly, the way she would have said it. I believed him, and it did not help. What happened to my guiding after that was not dramatic. I did not stop working. I did not sell my permit or close the business. I guided through that winter and the following spring, and the seasons after. Clients booked and waded and tipped, and left their reviews online the way they always had. I moved through the routine with a competence that was indistinguishable from care if you were not paying close attention. Owen Briggs, who ran the supply outfitter out of Marshall and had been selling me tippet and hook stock for 12 years, asked me in the spring following Lena's death how the season was shaping up. I said, "Getting there." He nodded and bagged my order, and that was the full extent of what I allowed out into the open. The South Bend I stopped walking entirely. I rerouted my client days, citing the spring runoff on the approach path, then citing the bank erosion later in the season, then just not mentioning it and keeping the route tight to the north side of the river where the holding water was nearly as good, and nobody asked questions. 3 seasons I did that. The flat rock at the South Bend sat empty every October while the light came over the ridge and touched the water, and nobody was there to watch it. I want to be honest about what I told myself during those 3 years, because I think the telling is the important part. I told myself I had processed it. I told myself I was functional, which I was, and that functional was enough. I told myself that grief for a client was a proportion of grief, a smaller grief, the appropriate kind, not the deep, unbounded kind that belongs to family. I told myself Lena would have hated any fuss on her account. All of that was probably true, and none of it was the whole story. Cora was the one honest thing in those 3 years. She was my black Labrador, 14 years old that autumn, going grey across the muzzle and around the eyes, partially deaf since her 12th birthday. She had been on the river with me since she was 8 weeks old. She knew every launch point, every boot path, every rock crossing by memory and by nose. She waded the shallows beside me in her early years, learned not to chase the fish, learned to sit calm on the bank when clients were casting. By 14, she mostly waited on the high bank above the waterline, sleeping in the sun when there was sun. She could still make the walk in. She just took it at her own pace and nobody argued with her about it. I lived alone on 12 acres above the river, in a farmhouse that had belonged to my father's family, and that I had spent 11 years making livable again, slowly, board by board, one winter project at a time. I had a good wood stove, a decent kitchen, a workshop in the barn where I tied flies in the evenings. Cora slept on an old wool blanket at the foot of the workbench. I tied and she slept, and the hours went that way through the winters. It was a life I had chosen deliberately, and mostly, it suited me. The ritual started without my quite deciding it. About 5 weeks after the 3rd anniversary of Lena's death, somewhere in mid-September, when the light was beginning to change and the maples on the south ridge were going amber at the edges, I found myself at the workbench one evening tying a Catskill-style Adams in size 16. It was a dry fly with no particular client in mind, not a pattern any of my fall bookings had asked for. I tied it well, better than I needed to. The wings split and upright, the hackle wound tight, the body dubbed smooth. When I was done, I held it under the lamp for a while, and then I put it in my shirt pocket instead of in a box. The next evening, for the first time in 3 years, I walked the South Bend path. I want to say there was some reason I gave myself, some practical justification. There wasn't. I just walked it. Cora came with me, taking the slope carefully on her older hips, stopping twice to read something in the air that I could not smell. The path opens at the flat rock, and I stood there in the last of the light and looked at the water running over the gravel bed. And after a while, I took the Adams out of my shirt pocket and set it on the flat rock. Not propped up, just laid flat on the stone surface, hook side down. Then I walked home. I went back the next evening and the fly was still there, just as I had left it. I sat on the rock for a while. Cora lay down in the dry grass of the high bank and put her head on her paws and watched the water. The herons were working the far shallows, and the river was making the low sound it makes in fall when the volume is down and the current runs clear over pale stone. It was a good kind of quiet. I went back the evening after that and replaced the fly with a fresh one, also an Adams, also size 16. This was the pattern Lena had caught her best fish on, a 16-inch brown in her 7th year on my water, a fish she had played with more patience than I expected and released with a genuine gentleness. She had photographed it once in the net and never asked for a replica mount, which told me something about her. I kept going back, 5 weeks of evenings, sometimes with Cora, sometimes alone when Cora's hips were bad, and she chose the warm kitchen over the walk. I tied a fresh fly every few days and placed it on the rock. I did not think about what I was doing in any organized way. I told myself it was just a walk, just habit, just the kind of thing a man does when the evenings get long in autumn. I was not good at admitting what it actually was, which was the simplest form of a conversation I had not known how to start. The first thing I noticed that was not ordinary was a sound, or rather an absence of one. On an evening in the 2nd week of October, I was sitting on the flat rock watching a spinner fall above the riffle when the wood thrushes that nested in the hemlock stand upstream went quiet. Not gradually, the way birds do when the light fails, but all at once. One moment, there were 3 of them calling in that liquid, overlapping way they have. And then there were none. The silence that replaced them had a different quality from ordinary quiet, a density I registered in my chest before I thought about it with my head. Cora lifted her muzzle from her paws and looked upstream. Her tail did not stiffen. She did not growl or whine. She just looked, ears moving, working the air. After a long moment, she put her head back down slowly, with the unhurried ease she showed when she had assessed something and found it acceptable. I watched her do that and felt the tension in my own shoulders ease without deciding to ease. I scanned the tree line across the river and saw nothing I could name. The hemlock shadows were deep by then. I stayed on the rock until the light was fully gone, listening, and nothing came of it. I walked home and told myself the birds had simply finished their evening calling. That explanation felt thin even as I applied it, but I let it sit. 3 evenings later, I found the stones. The flat rock had a small natural shelf at its upstream end, a ledge about 4 inches wide where water runoff had undercut the stone slightly. I had set the current Adams fly on the main face of the rock, the way I always did, When I arrived that evening, the fly was still there, but around it, on the main face, someone had arranged 7 small river stones in a loose arc. They were not random stones from the bank. They were the smooth, pale quartzite ones that come from the gravel bed under 3 feet of water in the middle of the river. You would have to wade in up to your thighs to collect them, and you would have to have selected them deliberately, because they were all within a narrow size range and all of a piece in colour. I stood and looked at that arrangement for a long time. I thought about flooding first, some unusual surge that might have deposited them, but the waterline on the rock showed no recent high water, and the fly itself had not moved at all. I thought about another person, a hiker on the South Bank path, someone who had made a small trail arrangement for their own reasons. That was possible. People do things along water. I could not find the part that made it feel wrong, so I left it as a hypothesis. If you have spent any meaningful time alone in wild country, you know what it feels like when the living things around you shift register. Not when they go quiet in fear, which has a sharp, contracted quality, but when they go quiet in attention, which is broader and steadier. The next evening, everything along the South Bend was in that second mode. The crows that worked the upper bank had settled and were not calling. A doe that had been feeding in the meadow grass above the rock stood with her head up and her ears wide, but did not bolt. Cora was with me that evening, and she walked to the rock beside me and stood with her nose high, reading, for longer than I had ever seen her hold that posture. Then she sat down beside me, pressed her warm flank against my leg, and stayed there. The fly I had placed 3 evenings before had been moved. It was now sitting on the ledge of stones, which had been added to, now 9 stones instead of 7, and the fly was resting on the topmost stone with its wings upright, propped carefully against the lip of the rock above it, so that it stood like a real insect resting on a real surface. The hackle caught the low light and turned it copper. Someone or something had handled that fly with enough delicacy not to crush the dubbing or collapse the wings, and had placed it as though it were alive. I am not a person who believes in things he cannot explain. I want to be clear about that. I have navigated by maps my whole life, read weather by what the sky actually does, rather than what I hoped it would do. Kept my clients' safety records clean for 27 years, because I trusted observation over instinct in every calculation that mattered. What I was looking at did not fit any category I was willing to trust. I did not go home right away. I stayed until full dark, sitting on the rock with Cora warm against my side, watching the tree line across the water, watching the hemlock shadows deepen and merge. There was one moment, maybe 15 minutes after the light failed on the ridge, when I saw a mass in the shadows at the far tree line. Not a clear shape, not an outline I could have described to someone else. Just a sense of volume and stillness that was different from trees. It was there, and then it was absorbed, and I could not say for certain that it had been there at all. Cora did not react. She breathed slow and steady under my hand. I walked home and I tied another Adams, and I did not sleep well. The following evening the sky was clear and the air had dropped to what felt like the middle 30s, the first real cold of the season coming down off the high ridges with the dryness of an early frost on it. I dressed for it. I put Cora in the warm kitchen with her supper and her blanket and walked the South Bend path alone. I did not know what I was going to find. I was not sure what I was hoping for, and I was less sure what I was afraid of. The flat rock was empty when I arrived. The stones were still arranged, 9 of them on the shelf, but the fly I had left last was gone. I set a new one on the rock face the way I always did. This one a size 16 Adams tied on a mustard hook I had dressed with orange thread at the head. A small difference, just something in it that was mine. I sat down on the rock and looked at the water. The Callaway was running low and clear, the way it does in the dry weeks before the November rains, and I could see the pale gravel through 2 feet of water 20 yards out. The current was slow. The surface was barely broken. I could hear my own breathing. Cora, I have to say, had always been better than me at knowing when to be still. In her younger years, she would alert and scan and take up ready posture. By 14, she had shed all that performative vigilance and settled into something quieter, a dog level of presence that was just pure attention without the commentary. When I saw her that evening at the top of the bank path, which she should not have been on because I had left her in the kitchen, I understood she had come through the dog door I had left cracked and followed the path at her own pace. She had arrived without my hearing her, which, given her deafness, felt like a symmetry. She came down to the flat rock, lay down at the edge of it, and put her chin on her forepaws, facing upstream. I will be honest about what I felt when I saw her there. It was not alarm. It was the specific relief of not being alone, and it made me realize how alone I had been on that rock for 3 years, even in the company of clients, even in the full flow of a working day. The tree line across the river had gone very still. Not the absence of wind, though there was no wind, something more specific than that. The quality of light across the water had not changed, the last of the western gold still holding on the hemlock tops, but the space between the trees on the far bank seemed to have condensed in some way I could not account for. The water between us was perhaps 30 feet across at that bend, shallow enough to wade in hip boots without difficulty. The far bank rose steeply from the waterline into the hemlock and rhododendron, and the shadows in there were full dark by now, the kind of dark that has its own texture. I had my eyes on the water when Cora lifted her head and looked directly across. Her ears went up, then settled. She made no sound. Her tail moved once across the rock surface, a single slow sweep, and was still. I looked where she was looking, at the water's edge on the far bank, in the space between 2 hemlocks where the rhododendron broke and the bank flattened to a narrow gravel bar. There was a shape that had not been there before. It was large. It was dark, the specific dark of something that has a coat of fur dense enough to hold shadow. It was standing still, not moving, simply present, and it was tall in the way that nothing in those hills should be tall, not 8 feet in any measurable sense, but substantially above the height of any man I had ever stood next to. The posture was not threatening. That is the detail I have turned over more times than any other in the years since, the way it was standing, which was the way a person stands when they are watching something they care about carefully, with their weight settled and their attention forward and no tension in the shoulders at all. I did not move. My breath went shallow, and I let it. Cora was watching the shape with the same quality of attention she had given the river all evening, steady and without fear, and I let her tell me what I needed to know about whether to be afraid, which was nothing, because she was not afraid. For a long moment, nothing happened. The river ran. The hemlocks held their dark. The shape across the water remained, watching, or seeming to watch, the way a figure that large and that still seems always to be doing the most deliberate possible thing. Then it moved, not toward me. Along the bank, downstream a few steps, and it bent, and in the low remaining light I watched it work at something on the gravel bar with a care and deliberateness that I had no language for. The movements were slow and specific. I could not see clearly at that distance in that light, but I could see that something was being arranged. The shape worked for perhaps 3 minutes, unhurried, and then it stood back up to its full height and was still again. I stayed where I was. My hands were cold. I had not noticed my hands getting cold, but they were. Cora had not moved. The shape across the water looked toward me, or toward the rock where I was sitting, and there was a moment, and I cannot verify this with any instrument or prove it to anyone living, when I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was specific, like being recognized by someone who has been watching you from a respectful distance for a long time, and has decided that this evening, in this light, they are going to let you know they have been there. It stepped back into the hemlock and the shadow took it. Not quickly, not with any alarm or concealment, just back and absorbed, the way a colour deepens when a cloud crosses the sun. One moment it was at the edge of the trees, and then it was not at the edge of the trees, and the tree line was just a tree line again. Cora put her chin back on her forepaws. The river kept running. I do not know how long I sat there before I stood up and crossed the shallows. I waded in hip-deep, 30 feet of cold October river in my barn boots and my flannel, which I would not recommend to any client. I reached the far bank and walked to the gravel bar where the shape had been working. There was a flat stone on the gravel, a stone too large to have arrived there by any current running in October, a stone about the size and shape of Lena's flat rock on the south bank, set level and deliberate. On it, laid across it at the precise angle that Lena had always rested her rod when she sat at the end of the afternoon, angled 45 degrees and tilted slightly toward the water, was a stick, smooth-barked and straight, the right length, the right proportion. And at the upriver end of that arrangement, at the place where the cork grip of a rod would rest, was the Adam's fly I had left on the rock that evening, the one tied with orange thread at the head. It was resting on the stone with its wings upright, supported in the same way the previous fly had been supported, balanced against a small quartzite pebble, so it stood as though alive. I stood over it with my wet boots on the gravel, and I did not try to make it into something I could categorize. It was arranged the way Lena had rested her rod. The rod angle, the fly at the grip end, the careful level placement of the stone. Something that had been watching the south bend of the Callaway River had looked at what I was bringing here and had looked at how it connected to what this place had been to someone who was gone, and had made that connection physical in the only language available to it. I have told this story twice. Once to my older sister, who listened without interrupting, and then sat quiet for a while. Once to you. I stood on that gravel bar for a long time with the cold water in my boots and Cora on the far bank, watching me from the flat rock, her tail moving once in that slow, patient way. I did not touch the arrangement. I crossed back through the shallows, sat down beside Cora, and stayed until I was sure the dark was complete and the shape was not coming back. Then I walked home. The following morning, Walt Marsh called at 7:45. I had been awake since 5. I watched his name come up on the phone screen and I picked up before the second ring had finished. He said, "Dean." I said, "Walt, I'm sorry I didn't call back sooner." He said something like, that was all right, and that he wasn't calling about that he just wanted to check in, see how I was doing with it. His voice sounded like hers had in the way voices sometimes carry down through families, a similar directness, a similar patience with silence. I said, "I'm getting there. I think I'm actually getting there this time." He was quiet a moment, and then he said she would have wanted to know I was fishing that bend still. I said I knew that. I said I was working on it. We talked for maybe 12 minutes. It was not a long call and it did not resolve anything in any clean way. But when I set the phone on the counter afterward, the kitchen felt like a different size than it had felt in 3 years. Not smaller, more its actual size. The way a room feels when you have been breathing correctly in it for the first time in a while. I spent that morning in the workshop. I tied 6 Adam's flies, all size 16, all with the orange thread head, a half dozen against the season. I put them in a small compartment box that had been Lena's, one she had left in the truck cab by accident her last October, and that I had been unable to mail back and unable to throw away. I put the box on the workbench shelf where it had sat for 3 years, and I looked at it there among the other boxes, and it looked right where it was. I guided the South Bend the following October, not alone. I had a client, a retired veterinarian from Knoxville named Carl, a man who had been fishing trout water for 40 years, and who fished with the kind of economical precision that meant I could mostly just walk the bank and let him work. We launched from the north side and worked down through the morning session, and in the afternoon I brought him around to the flat rock. He read the water off the South Bend for an hour in the October light, moving slowly through the shallows in his waders, casting a long, clean line across to the holding water near the far bank. He caught and released 2 browns, one of them close to 14 inches, and when the light started coming over the ridge in that late, golden way, he came back to the flat rock and sat down and rested his rod across his knees and just watched the water. I stood back up the bank and let him have that. Some moments are not for guiding. Cora was on the high bank behind me, in the dry grass where she liked to lie, working the smell of the afternoon air with her grey muzzle. She was slow on the walk in now and slower still on the walk out, but she made it both ways under her own will, and I had long since stopped being surprised by her. The hemlocks on the far side of the river held their dark, the way hemlocks always do, patient and full, the kind of dark that has been there longer than any of us, and will be there, past all of us. The river ran low and clear over pale stone. I did not look for anything across the water. I did not need to. What I knew by then was a different kind of knowing from what I had brought to the South Bend 3 years before. Not certainty about what the world contains, but a willingness to let it contain more than I had been allowing. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Carl looked up from the water and said, "This is a good stretch." I said, "It is." He said, "You ever fish it yourself?" I thought about that for a moment. "Working on it," I said. He nodded and turned back to the water. The light held on the surface in that particular way it does at the South Bend, the ridge angle giving it those extra 20 minutes nobody else on the river gets, and the water ran, and the afternoon was still, and Cora lay in the warm grass on the high bank with her grey muzzle on her paws, watching the river with the patient and total attention she had given it for 14 years, the way she had given everything she loved her full and unhurried presence, until the light changed and it was time to go home. The flat rock was empty when we left. The fly I had laid there that morning was gone, lifted probably by the light breeze that had moved through in the late afternoon. I did not replace it. There would be other evenings, other Octobers, other size 16 flies tied on cold winter nights at the bench, with the wood stove ticking behind me. The river would be there when I came back. Some things you stop needing to understand. You just carry them, and they change what you are able to do. And that turns out to be enough.